Tamsin, thanks so much for having us in your studio today. We're here because you're currently showing an exhibition with us for the Sun Gods, which is a new body of works on paper, watercolours and monotypes. So I wondered if you could start by telling us a bit about the title of the show, For the Sun Gods.
Sure. I've been thinking a lot about the origin of different plant species and how many of the plants that we encounter day to day may actually have come from other parts of the world. And that's easy to recognize in really unusual, interesting pot plants, but I've been thinking particularly about flowers and shrubs or trees that are more integrated in our gardens or landscapes that you might easily take for granted that have been there all along. So when I started working with the dahlias, I felt that it was really important to learn a bit more about their origins. And so my knowledge is still, I've probably only scratched the surface, but I was really interested to learn that, as far as we know, they were first cultivated by the Aztecs, and they're said to have associated them with the sun gods. So yeah, the title of the body of work for the sun gods is quite simply wanting to honor their origins in that way. And for me personally as well, the idea of offering something to the gods is, it's not necessarily a specific religious act, but it's like, in what way can we make a gesture of love and recognition and just an honoring of the extraordinary ecology of our planet that is within this extraordinary universe. Yeah, so that's what's behind it for me, this idea of For the Sun Gods.
Great. And so for this series, you know, your practice is concerned with the preservation of botanical environments, and you spent time visiting urban parks in London and also Worton Organic Kitchen Garden in Oxfordshire, and that was in between periods of lockdown. Mm-hmm. So what was it about this time and these spaces that inspired you for this body of work?
Yeah, I think in a way, although our worlds, because our movement has been so restricted, although our worlds have become smaller, in a way they've also become, within that small space, they've become bigger because you spend time in your environment in a different way. And so I found that I've got to know a whole lot more of our local parks in a way that I hadn't before, or that I hadn't even managed to. I've known of a park but just never got there because I was always running off with another agenda, you know. And so, and along with getting to know the parks that I'm really lucky to have in my area, at the same time, certain plants have come into focus in a different way. So yeah, I've been drawing a lot from those experiences. And yeah, one of the very few local trips that we made between lockdowns last summer was to visit my brother who lives in Oxford, and it's always a real treat for us to go to Worton Organics. They have just the most gorgeous kitchen garden, and they have a huge sort of flower patch. Patch doesn't seem a fair description, but it's full of dahlias. And yeah, this last summer they caught my attention in a way that they hadn't before. And I know I'd seen them the previous year, but somehow hadn't really seen them in the way that I did this last summer. So I took I think it was only 4 or 5 photos that I took casually on my iPhone, but then brought them back to the studio and ended up referencing those couple of photographs over and over again, and really allowed the work to evolve out of these few references. Working particularly with these spaces of parks at this time is also just it's interesting how, because our movements have been so restricted, how I think it's helped us to, or it's brought into focus how important access to green spaces is for everyone's well-being and mental health, and which also at the same time that brings into focus the inequality within our communities about access to those kind of living spaces and how it's not so easy for some people.
So we're here in your studio today and you have a beautiful old intaglio printing press. Can you tell us about your process and how you use it to make your monotypes?
Yes, so it's a press used traditionally for etchings and monotypes, and I work with watercolours for making monotypes, and how that works is I paint onto a sheet of plastic or acetate, and watercolours they would have a tendency to pull away from that slippery surface, so you need to prepare the plate with you need to degrease it, and if you want to prepare it with like a slightly sticky gum arabic so that it's able to hold the watercolour when you paint onto it. And as you paint the watercolour on, you allow it to dry for a few hours or overnight, and then in the meantime you take your paper, you soak it, blot it so that it's just the right dampness, and then you run it through the press, which puts it under huge pressure, and you place your watercolor on the table and then put the damp paper on top of it, run both of them together through the press, and then the watercolor, that dried watercolor, the pigment gets picked up by the damp paper, and every mark just transfers immaculately. It's quite amazing in that way. And I really enjoy it because I find there's a real element of unpredictability in the process, and it becomes about how that mark, in the way that it differs from working direct to paper with watercolor, it's about how the mark responds to being on a very fluid, slippery surface, and how the mark dries on that surface. So
you're having to work in reverse as well.
Yes, and you what you're painting comes out in reverse, so you have all these things kind of take away a little bit of your control, which I find really, for me, it's really important in my process in terms of the way that I often have a reference image to begin with, but I don't like to hold too tightly to that. So I really enjoy when the process helps me lose the image through the making, so that something new comes out of the reference. And recently I've actually been working over, so once you print the plate, you can only get one impression from that plate, but a residue of the image remains on the plate, and I really like to use that as the starting point for the next work I make. So I work back into that plate, and it means that there's, again, it almost makes it a bit confusing for you because you can't see where you've painted or what's going to transfer. So again, you lose a little bit more control that way, and then some of the previous image comes through. And yeah, I enjoy creating new images through that process. And for example, this one that we have in the show, Everywhere I've Loved, this was, I think, the kind of fifth incarnation of the plate. So each time the landscape kind of evolved, and even the flowers evolved into a landscape, and it changed with each print so much that it became an entirely new place in a way. And that's why, yeah, when I look at it, and I wanted to call it Everywhere I Love, it is because it became more of a ambiguous sort of, it could be multiple places, and it had feelings for me of many of the different landscapes that I have loved, kind of all being rolled into one. And I think with an element of nostalgia within that as well right now, when I haven't been able to go home to my family in South Africa, and yeah, so that's come up in that image.